And of course, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, also a superb example of Riḍā. Much of his life was lived in states of tragedy, bereavement in particular, losing his sons, which is for any man a catastrophe. When his son Ibrahim died, there's a very touching image in the seerah about how he addressed his dead son and said, وَإِنَّا عَلَى فِرَاقِكَ يَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ لَمَحْزُونِينَ. We are sorry at your departure, at losing you, Ibrahim. وَلَا نَقُولُ مَا يُسْخِطُ الرَّبِّ. But we don't say what will make the Lord angry. So this is a fundamental Quranic virtue, and it's not just a moral virtue, it's a theological virtue, because it reflects your consciousness that everything is the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you can't see the reason for it, well, so what? We're just human beings with limited, contingent, created minds. In the mind of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't need to understand it. We just accept and know for sure that the rahmah will predominate in the end. There's a story that Sayyidina Jalaluddin Rumi tells of an ant that's creeping across the carpet in a mosque. And the ant, in, of course, beautiful Persian strophic verse, complains to God, saying, what is this, these bumps and strange colours and patterns, and this must have been created just as a meaningless obstacle course, and what a futile thing to have made. But of course the carpet maker, looking at it from above, can see the patterns and can see the purpose of it and can see that the whole thing is perfect and is good. And our lives are often like that. We often can't make sense of the misfortunes because we are two-dimensional, we're at ground level, we can't see what it all means. But the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, even if he can't always see, that this is a manifestation of Allah's will, which is always good and is always perfect and is always beautiful. Now, one implication of this loss of Riḍā that we now find our communities very often in is that we tend to judge others. Perhaps because we're not content with the way Allah is arranging history at this particular moment, that we get jumpy and agitated and our tawheed and even our iman seems to be challenged. And so we like to attack others. And we are often extremely judgmental. And one of the greatest errors that one can make in this time, according to the ulama, is the error of assuming that this is a time for perfection, for rigorism. That the harder the world becomes for the believers, the more perfect we have to demand everybody is. So that if you come into a mosque and you're not dressed in a thobe and a kufi, I've come across mosques where they won't even let you in, which from the point of view of traditional fiqh is completely haram and completely disgraceful, but illustrates the fact that we get panicked about the imperfections of the outside world and we want to make our own communities a space of absolute rigorous perfection. Sometimes we find that people are alienated from the religion altogether. Quite often those brothers and sisters who attribute themselves to the great lofty maqam of da'wah will actually scare off 100 people for every one person that they attract. And the people that they attract are often not the best people, not the people who are spiritually and morally the most impressive or the most educated. I remember once meeting an English woman in Cairo who had converted to Islam more or less nominally when she married a secular Egyptian. And she'd started to get interested in the religion, as sometimes happens, and somebody had given her a tasbih, prayer beads, and she was clicking away at these one day, not knowing much about the religion, but wanting to know more, when an angry purist came along and said, "Don't you know this is bid'ah, this is haram?" And he pulled them out of her hands and broke them, so the beads flew all over the floor. And she was so damaged by the harshness of that moment, then she said, "I don't want to learn anything more about Islam." And that's been her state for the last 20 years. She's just alienated and put off. Whereas she might have come in, and by now she might have been an asset to the community. There's too much of that going on. There is too much judgment of others and not enough judgment of ourselves. There is too much self-righteousness and not enough self-knowledge. And one way in which we can heal that is to remember that people's weakness in this age is very understandable. It's an age in which it's difficult to do even the basics, let alone the perfections that are demanded of us. If you look at the time of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, they had no excuse for being weak, because everything was blazing before them. They saw karamat. Particularly in the Medina period, it was as if the normal laws of causality had been suspended and everything was a karama. Public mu'jizat, miracles of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam recorded in the sound hadith. For instance, the famous instance of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to give his khutbahs and his addresses standing, but holding on with his hand to one of the pillars which were made of the trunks of palm trees in the mosque. وَلَمَّا صُنِعَ لَهُ الْمِنْبَرِ, when the minbar was made, and he started to preach on the minbar, سَمِعْنَا, this is the Sahaba saying, سَمِعْنَا لِذَلِكَ الْجِذْعِ صَوْتًا كَصَوْتِ الْعِشَارِ. We heard that column moaning like the moaning of a camel. حَتَّى تَصَدَّعَ وَانْشَقَّ, until it split and cracked. فَوَضَعَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ يَدَهُ عَلَيْهِ فَسَكَتْ. And Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam put his hand on it and it was silent. Witnessed by I don't know how many Sahaba in the mosque. And it said that same jidha, that same palm trunk, is still there buried underneath the minbar. Now when you see things like that, you don't have excuses to be weak and feeble and lazy and not to go on jihad and not to attend 5 times a day the prayers. Other examples that show how the animate and inanimate world were more or less speaking because of the extraordinary presence of the vehicle of revelation amongst them is a hadith from Sayyidina Ali, karramallahu wajha, where he says, كنا بمكة مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. We were in Mecca with the Rasul عليه الصلاة والسلام. So this is early. فخرج إلى بعض نواحيها, and he went out to one of its neighbouring areas. And this is one of the aspects of the Prophet's teaching method that is so beautiful, that he didn't just teach in the mosque, but he used to go out hiking, as it were, in the hills and mountains around Mecca and Medina, because he loved virgin nature. فَخَرَجَ إِلَى بَعْضِ نَوَاحِيهَا, and he went out to some of its environs. فَمَا اسْتَقْبَلَهُ شَجَرَةٌ وَلَا حَجَرٌ إِلَّا قَالَ لَهُ السَّلَامُ عَلَيْكَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. And not a single tree or stone met him without saying to him, Salamu alayka ya Rasulullah, peace be upon you, ya Rasulullah. This is from an eyewitness, Sayyidina Ali. Another famous story from the Medina period this time is perhaps even more extraordinary and exists in a number of versions. It's a hadith narrated by Sayyidina Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, radiallahu anhu, and it's called the hadith al-Dhi'b, or the hadith of the wolf. And it concerns a pagan shepherd who was out in the backcountry near Medina. And a wolf came and fastened its jaws on one of the man's sheep. And he drove it off. And then the wolf turned to him and spoke and said, أَلَا تَتَّقِ اللَّهِ حِلْتَ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ رِزْقِي. Don't you fear Allah? You've come between me and between my rizq, between my provision. And of course this rough Bedouin was amazed. And the wolf speaks again, and he says, أَلَا أُخْبِرُكَ بِأَعْجَبَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. Shall I not tell you about something that's even more extraordinary than that? رَسُولُ اللَّهِ بَيْنَ الْحَرَّتَيْنِ يُحَدِّثُ النَّاسَ بِأَنْبَاءِ مَا قَدْ سَبَقَ. There is a messenger of God between the two lava plains, in other words in Medina, telling people the news of past peoples. So of course the man came and found the Prophet and explained this to him, and the Prophet told him to tell it to the others because this was a mu'jiza, and this was a form of honouring that man. So the Sahaba were seeing this all the time. That was an age of miracles. And those who saw those miracles and still were lazy or didn't get it right, or didn't believe, were really in a position akin to the position of Fir'aun, who saw so many miracles, custom made for his attention. The staff that turned into a snake, the hand that came from his pocket glowing white, the 7 plagues, and yet still wouldn't go along with it because he was so pleased with his own self. And it's only the self and the nafs and the desire to be one's own precious identity that can hold on in the presence of a sainted human being. Because you can't argue with sainthood or light or truth. It's there. There's no logic that can overwhelm it. It's proof. Ra'y al-ayn, it's there. It's only the nafs that can cause you to hold on. But now we live in very different times. This is the meaning of a number of hadith which are there as a mercy for us. فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَاءِ. Blessed are the strangers, those who come and haven't had the blessing of seeing even the Sahaba and hearing their stories, but come so many generations, so many eons later on. And a sound hadith says, إِنَّكُمْ فِي زَمَانٍ مَنْ تَرَكَ مِنْكُمْ عُشْرَ مَا أُمِرَ بِهِ هَلَكَ. You are living in a time, he says, when whoever abandons a tenth of what he's been commanded to do will be destroyed. وَسَيَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ مَنْ عَمِلَ مِنْهُمْ عُشْرَ مَا أُمِرَ بِهِ نَجَى. But there shall come upon people a time when somebody who does a tenth of what he's been commanded to do will be saved. Now that doesn't mean that we can just sit back and say, well, we can be lazy. Because, how many of us can say that we're doing a tenth of what the Sahaba were doing? It's probably not even 100th. It's not an excuse to be lazy. But it is a prophetic indication, if the hadith has any purpose at all, that we need to be merciful with people in this time. And that when people are hesitant and stumbling, in most cases that's not their fault. It's the fault of the world, it's the fault of their upbringing, it's the fault of us very often for not being a good example, for being beautiful and being attractive. And we need to be endlessly forgiving of those people. When we see somebody at the Eid prayer who's, we can conjecture, uncharitably probably not been there since the previous Eid prayer, we mustn't rush up to him and say, brother, your trousers are too long, or brother, your wife is wearing lipstick, or something like that, because the chances are if we do that, he won't come next to Eid prayer. We need to make his acquaintance, make him feel welcome, very gently as it were, take his hand and reassure him that everything's all right and that the mosque is his place as much as it is anybody else's, and befriend him and show that we can't pass judgment when it's not to our credit that we're Muslims, because Allah yahdi man yasha. Faith is a gift. He gives the gift to whoever He wills. We can't say that we're better than others because we've achieved it. We don't achieve faith. We don't achieve anything. Everything we have is Allah's grace, and He can snatch it from us at any moment. I think we need to be aware that outside the mosques and outside the circle of our Islamic societies, there is a huge shadowy area of people who often very strongly identify themselves with Islam, but we don't see them very much. Sometimes we don't see them at all. You could call them, as it were, the B team. They're still Muslims. They'll stick up for Muslim causes if they're pressed. They're on the right side of the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. They sympathize with the Muslims in Bosnia. Maybe sometimes they'll come to Eid prayer. Most of the time they'll try and avoid pork and alcohol and so forth, but they don't come to the mosques. And I would say that most of the mosques have done a very poor job of opening their doors to those people. That, like all human beings, those people feel a need for dhikr, for ibadah, for having moments of quiet in their lives. But somehow the Muslim community as presently structured doesn't have a lobby or a hospitable area in which they can come and not feel under pressure, not feel judged, not be made to feel inferior, that if they're not doing everything perfectly, the moment they step in the mosque, then we come up to them angrily and shout so that we never see them again. And I hope that will improve, because those people represent a clear majority of the communities, not just in the West, but also in the Muslim world, increasingly. People who identify themselves culturally, politically with Islam, but can't quite find a habitable space within it for them to be religiously. Now, this virtue of Riḍā, I've been suggesting, really is the key to unlocking all of these possibilities of da'wah, possibilities of being beautiful and attractive, so that we can attract the world as the Prophet ﷺ melted the hearts of the world. And Riḍā really has to be taught as a necessary entailment of La ilaha illallah. Because